Ukraine isn't the only country standing up to Russia. Moldova too is stepping up to the plate. Eager to reclaim its full sovereignty and independence, its government is taking major steps towards taking the Transnistria region, which has long been seen as a puppet state of the Putin regime, out of the Kremlin's hands and back into Moldovan control. To understand what's happening and how the situation might evolve from here, it's important to first step back and look at the bigger picture, exploring how and why Transnistria split from the rest of Moldova to begin with. Transnistria, also known as the Pridnestrovian Moldavian Republic (PMR), is a narrow patch of land that sits between the Dniester River and the Moldova-Ukraine border. It covers 1,600 square miles or 4,163 square kilometers of land and is home to around 367,000 people. And most of the world officially regards it as part of Moldova. But that doesn't quite tell the full story, because Transnistria does not, at all, operate like a regular region of Moldova. It has its own separate currency, capital, and even its own national anthem. It also operates its own government, parliament, police force, postal system, and military. This all began decades ago when the Soviet Union started to collapse in the late 1980s and early 1990s. At the time, Moldova, which was a Soviet republic, was experiencing a surge of nationalist politics, which led to a strong movement oriented around promoting the Romanian language and fostering stronger ties with neighboring Romania. Many of the Russian and Ukrainian-speaking Moldovans living east of the Dniester River, however, fear that this might go too far, potentially leading to some sort of unification between Romania and Moldova that would leave those people feeling marginalized and isolated in their own homeland. Tensions began to bubble up, and Soviet-aligned officials stepped in to announce the formation of the PMR in 1990, just before Moldova formally departed the USSR. A brief war, the Transnistrian War, erupted soon after that, pitting pro-PMR forces like the Transnistrian Republic Guard, militia, and Neo-Cossack units against pro-Moldovan forces, including the Moldovan military and police force. Russia intervened, siding with the separatists and deploying its 14th Army to reinforce their ranks. Their involvement effectively prevented Moldova's forces from regaining control of the region, and Russia also played an integral role in negotiating a ceasefire in 1992. That ceasefire has held, but the status of Transnistria has remained unclear ever since. In the intervening years, it's operated outside of Moldova's authority, functioning like a small independent state despite being heavily reliant on Russia and not formally recognized by the international community. From the Kremlin's perspective, Transnistria is a valuable asset and one that Russia is eager to keep hold of. Moscow maintains a sizable force of up to 1,500 peacekeeper troops on the ground in Transnistria at any one time, while also boasting its own military base in the region, as well as an extensive ammunition dump. Moldova, meanwhile, has repeatedly called for the withdrawal of Russia's soldiers from the territory, but numerous rounds of long-running talks have failed to yield any tangible results. And it's not just a question of troops. Russia also provides political and financial backing to this breakaway territory, which it also uses as a kind of strategic foothold to exert political, military, and economic pressure over Moldova itself, preventing the country's integration into important alliances like NATO and the European Union. In other words, Moscow leverages its presence in Transnistria as a way to indirectly control Moldova's fate. For years, there's also been a prevailing fear in Moldova and beyond that Russia's President Vladimir Putin could attempt to orchestrate a Ukraine-style invasion of the country, using Transnistria as a springboard for such an attack. Putin might even attempt a repeat of the same playbook he used in Ukraine. There, in the early days of the invasion, he claimed that his special military operation was necessary to denazify the nation and save ethnic Russians in Ukraine's eastern regions, like Donetsk and Luhansk, from persecution and even a possible genocide. He could make up a similar story in regard to Moldova, claiming that the country's pro-European government poses some sort of existential threat to the people of the PMR, and arguing that the only option is to send in Russian troops and establish some sort of security buffer along the Transnistrian border. Indeed, Moldovan officials have been sounding the alarms about such a scenario for quite some time. In April of 2025, for example, Former Moldovan intelligence head Yuri Brichag called Russia's military presence in the region a very real threat to both Moldovan security and European stability, adding that the Kremlin's war machine could feasibly force its way through Ukrainian territory and march on the Moldovan capital. If, God forbid, the Russians succeed in breaking through and bypassing Odessa, they could enter Transnistria, and from there they could reach Chisinau in days. This is just one of the many reasons why Moldovan officials are so eager to oust Russia from the region once and for all. And their moment may have arrived at last. Here's why. Before the war with Ukraine began, there was little hope of any sort of reunification between Moldova and Transnistria. The region enjoyed strong support from Russia, most notably receiving free natural gas for more than 30 years. That gas fueled Transnistrian businesses, heated people's homes, and propped up the area's economy. It also powered much of the rest of Moldova, since the country's biggest power station, the Kurchurgan power station, is situated within the PMR's borders. At the start of 2025, however, everything changed. A 5-year deal between Russia's Gazprom and Ukraine's Naftogaz expired, plunging the PMR into an unprecedented energy crisis. Overnight, the population suddenly found themselves without heating or hot water. Energy tariffs skyrocketed, and some smaller settlements and villages were completely cut off from the essential energy they needed to survive. The whole of Moldova was affected by this, but it was the Transnistrian people who felt the biggest impact, struggling with repeated rolling blackouts and icy cold homes on a regular basis. Moscow scrambled for a solution, while the European Parliament stepped in with a $1.9 billion support package to help Moldova manage the crisis. Transnistria, however, has continued to suffer. Throughout 2025, its economy contracted by a whopping 18%. Industrial production fell 30%, while inflation rose to a staggering 15%. The region's per capita GDP for the year sat at a lowly €4,150, far below the €7,250 average for the rest of Moldova. As a result of Ukraine blocking the once steady stream of gas and other supplies from Russia through its territory and into Transnistria, the PMR has been forced to look westward, turning to the European Union for support and stability during its ongoing economic state of emergency. And its energy crisis got even worse early in 2026, when the war in Iran broke out, forcing Tiraspol authorities to take drastic actions. In early March, for example, the Transnistrian government disconnected all gas-powered enterprises, heating and hot water only being provided to local households, and the Kurchurgan thermoelectric power plant has been forced to become coal-only, as it no longer receives the gas it needs to operate at pre-2025 levels. In short, the entire region is arguably in the weakest position it's ever been. And with Russia having to cope with its own crises, like the fact that it's now suffered more than 1.25 million casualties and its own economy teeters on the brink of complete collapse, the PMR cannot rely on Moscow magically swooping in to save it anytime soon. Moldovan officials evidently understand all this. Indeed, as the country's deputy prime minister, Valeriu Chiver, puts it, this is a completely different situation from what we had at the start of the full-scale war in Ukraine in 2022, and even more so from previous years. The evolution of the situation in the Transnistrian region from an economic and social point of view is today completely dependent on Chisinau, including the fact that the Transnistrian region has practically become an island between Ukraine and the Republic of Moldova. Now, sensing a potentially unprecedented and invaluable opportunity that they don't want to miss, the Moldovan government has started to close in on the region and even organised a historic and potentially game-changing meeting with Transnistrian representatives, which took place on February 26. But before we take a closer look at how that meeting unfolded and what it might mean for Moldova's future, this is why we make the military show, to explain how power really moves. If you're new here, hit subscribe so you don't miss what's next. The February meeting, which was the first between representatives from the two sides in almost a year, took place in the Transnistrian capital of Tiraspol, and the Deputy Prime Minister wasted no time in making his position clear, opening the meeting with a simple but meaningful remark to remind the PMR and the wider world of who the city rightfully belongs to. Hello everyone, we're glad to be in Tiraspol, Republic of Moldova. Moldovan journalists were also in attendance at the event, despite not normally being allowed into the region. During the meeting, Kiev called for respect for human rights in the region, free access for journalists, and a shift towards teaching in the Romanian language rather than Russian in local schools. Announcing its government's long-term goals, Kiev stated, "Our clear objective is the reintegration of the Dniester left bank region into the legal, economic, financial, social, and food space of Moldova." He went on to note that thousands of people in the area already commute across the Dniester River to work in other Moldovan regions, and many also travel across the country for education and medical care too. In essence, he was saying that the reintegration process is already underway, and it wouldn't necessarily take all that much for the PMR to return to the Moldovan fold entirely. His Transnistrian counterpart, Vitaly Ignatieff, the head of the PMR's foreign ministry, who also happens to be a wanted man in Ukraine due to his associations with Moscow, felt that the talks between the two sides were a good sign of things to come, while urging for a clear focus on the needs of the people while avoiding what he called politicization. With the PMR's separatist leaders effectively being backed into a corner and running rapidly out of room, analysts like Andrei Cururaru feel that now is the time for Moldova to take action and reintegrate the breakaway region. These demands won't be met right away, but we see Chisinau taking the lead. Until now, Chisinau has mostly reacted while Tiraspol set the agenda, and talks have focused on technical and economic issues rather than political ones. Now, it's clear that Chisinau's leaders know what they want for the Transnistrian region. Fellow analyst Jon Tabata agrees, noting that Moldova at last has the upper hand in negotiations with the region. Transnistria now depends completely on Chisinau, and the authorities should use all the advantages they have. Chisinau's main goal is to prevent a humanitarian crisis, avoid making things worse, and keep the reintegration process peaceful. For now, all the signs suggest that Moldova is eager to grasp this once-in-a-lifetime chance at reintegration and do everything in its power to achieve it. Indeed, mere days before Kiev visited Tiraspol, the Moldovan president, Maia Sandu, signed a decree to strip citizenship from 9 members of the separatist administration. It was the clearest sign yet that Chisinau is ready to crack down on the breakaway regime. Explaining the decision, the presidency said that 2 of those targeted fought on the side of the separatists in the 1992 Dniester War, adding that all 9 were involved in particularly serious acts that harmed the interests of Moldova. Stanislav Secariu, a Moldovan national security advisor, shed further light on the situation, explaining, "These acts were committed in the interests of a foreign state that violates the neutrality of our country and is waging a war of aggression against the neighboring state of Ukraine. The withdrawal of citizenship is a measure provided for by law, applied in cases where the fundamental interests of Moldova are affected." The PMR hasn't responded too kindly, with Ignatieff calling the citizenship annulment a destructive act. "We're seeing pressure on Transnistrians, on specific individuals, and on Transnistria as a whole. We consider such actions destructive." But Moldovan officials are no longer willing to bow down and abide by the PMR's agenda. They're ready to retake what's theirs, ousting the Russians and reunifying their land at last. It's a noble goal, but one that won't necessarily be all that easy to achieve. Even with Russia and Transnistria in a relatively weak moment, there are still several challenges for Chisinau to overcome. The first is related to cost. Moldova is one of the poorest states in all of Europe. If it wants to reintegrate Transnistria, it will somehow need to cover the cost of the process. For example, given that Transnistria is home to around 367,000 people, most of those individuals will have to be added to the Moldovan pension system. The regime also has its own security force, made up of around 15,000 people. They too will need to be retrained and integrated into Moldova's own defense and security institutions, a process which is not only expensive but risky too. All in all, experts estimate that full reintegration could cost anywhere from 500 million euros up to €1 billion per year for the first 3 years. Fortunately, plans are already in place to raise the required funds. The Deputy PM recently announced the formation of a convergence fund, which should help to cover the diverse cost of reunification with Transnistria. The government will use taxes and customs exemptions to increase this fund over time. A group of deputies from Moldova's ruling Action and Solidarity Party has also submitted draft legislation to ensure that all businesses throughout the country will be treated equally and fairly throughout the reintegration process. On top of this, Moldovan authorities have also sought to improve living standards on the opposite side of the Dniester River to Transnistria, essentially showing the people of the PMR how much better their lives could be if they reintegrated. As the region grows poorer and slips ever further into its energy crisis, its people are starting to see that the grass really might be greener on the other side after all. Tens of thousands of them are already commuting over the river each day to work at Moldovan companies, and that number has risen in recent times, as Cururaru confirms. The number of people from the Transnistrian region working in Chisinau has clearly increased. We also see that salaries and prices in Transnistria have changed, lowering the quality of life there. And the disparity in living standards between Transnistria and the rest of Moldova is only going to increase in the future if the region refuses reintegration. Moldova has announced plans to double its minimum wage by 2030, for example. This benefit will only apply to Transnistria if it agrees to become part of Moldova. But with Moldova looking set to become stronger and more prosperous in the years ahead, especially as it eases away from Russia and strengthens its connections with Europe and the rest of the Western world, the decision looks like an increasingly obvious and easy one for the PMR's people to make. There's just one final obstacle standing in the way of a peaceful reintegration process: Russia. While the people of Transnistria, and even its separatist leaders, may eventually agree to rejoin Moldova, the Kremlin is unlikely to acquiesce quite as easily. It's evident that Moscow wants to maintain its influence and control over the region, as shown by the constant year-round presence of Russian troops in Transnistria since the separatist war of 1992. Russia also owns an enormous ammunition depot close to the Transnistrian village of Kolbazna. It's one of the largest munition stockpiles in all of Eastern Europe, and it's situated barely a mile away from the Ukrainian border. Expert estimates state that there are around 20,000 tons of old Soviet supplies inside, and most likely some larger pieces of military equipment as well. While a lot of the munitions inside are decades old, with some even dating back to the Second World War, Russia still wouldn't want to simply give up those supplies. Numerous analysts agree, with Tabata stating that Russia is highly unlikely to bring its troops home voluntarily. The problem, however, is that even though there's only a relatively small amount of Russian troops in the region, anywhere from 1,500 to 3,000 according to various sources, Moldova wouldn't want to oust them by force. It doesn't have a large army, with only 5,000 active duty personnel and 58,000 more in reserve, nor does Moldova have any tanks or other operational assets of note. It's simply nowhere near strong enough to go toe-to-toe with even a small Russian force in the same way that Ukraine has. Plus, Chisinau wouldn't want to give Putin any excuse to send more of his armed forces to Moldovan soil. Instead, it will have to rely on diplomacy, as well as aid from its European allies like its close neighbour Romania, to slowly but surely pile pressure on the Kremlin. If it can keep on stirring up support among the Transnistrian people for full reintegration, it will already be one step closer to acquiring true independence and freeing itself from the Kremlin's control once and for all. Over the past few years, it's become clear that Russia has been planning something big, something beyond its fight with Ukraine. It's eyeing the rest of Europe. There are rumors that Russia spent the better part of 2023 and 2024 reviving a Soviet-era military base just 100 miles from Finland's border. It's a single garrison district in Petrozavodsk in Karelia. There, Russia is amassing what it calls the 44th Army Corps. This is a formation that, on paper, could eventually host up to 15,000 troops, up from around 3,000 currently in the region. Finnish broadcaster Yle, using satellite imagery and Finnish military analysis, has confirmed that a Russia training area dormant since the early 2000s has been transitioned from overgrown forest to an active construction site. New facilities are going up, vehicles are being parked in the open, and the infrastructure of a long-term staging hub is beginning to take shape. But when you look closer at the satellite imagery, read the order of battle, and trace where these units have been actually deployed, this revival tells a different story. In truth, Russia is trying to create yet another posturing piece to be used as a scare tactic aimed at NATO. Some sources suggest that a war between the two forces might be inevitable, but it's a move that they also believe has already backfired, creating yet another humiliation for Russian President Vladimir Putin. So, time for a deeper dive. The action around Petrozavodsk is only part of the buildup. In actuality, the full scale of the rebuilding covers 3 other sites: Kamenka on the Karelian Isthmus, Severomorsk 2, and Olynia. Kamenka is by far the most problematic for international relations, being only 40 miles from Finland's border, with satellite imagery suggesting 130 tents that could house up to 2,000 troops if they were fully manned. Some reports also suggested Russia is expanding a motorized rifle brigade at the base in Kamenka, where the 138 Guards Motorized Rifle Brigade is stationed. Independent outlet Medusa has also reported that another unit in the region, the 25th Motorized Rifle Brigade near Luga, could be expanded to nearly 10,000 troops, potentially boosting the area's overall military readiness. Severomorsk 2 is a formerly inactive airfield that's been restationed with Russian helicopters, either the Mi-8 or Mi-17 series, and the Olynia base is housing strategic bombers. If that last base sounds familiar, it's because Ukraine has already targeted it previously in July 2025 during the famous Operation Spiderweb. After a dozen Tupolev bombers that were stationed in the base were targeted by drones, Russia doubled down on using some of its northernmost locations for aircraft storage, transporting more bombers to the base and trying to reinforce it against future drone attacks. All of this is presumably a part of the broader effort, publicized in early 2025, to modernize Russia's military infrastructure in the region. Murmansk Regional Governor Andrei Chibis announced in early 2024 that the entire military refit will cost Russia somewhere around 42 billion rubles, roughly $460 million at the time. This is an enormous undertaking and a huge budgetary drain for a country that's already in an active war and yet somehow planning for another one. So, the question isn't whether Russia is building, it clearly is. The question is what that build actually means and what Finland is going to do about it. But why is this particular piece of territory so important to both countries? Petrozavodsk is the capital of the Republic of Karelia on the western shore of Lake Onega. Only 100 miles away from the nearest border, it's close enough to Finland to matter strategically. Yet, at the same time, it's far enough from Ukraine to let Moscow pretend it's building toward the future rather than shoring up the present. The actual importance of Karelia to the broader Russia-Finland geopolitics only makes this more suspicious. The region is the only reliable land route between the two countries. It was the site of the prolonged Russo-Finnish War during World War II, when the Soviet Union invaded Finland under the pretense of security concerns over St. Petersburg. But even broader than this, the Russian region itself is a vital strategic highway, figuratively, between the nuclear weapon arsenals housed on the Kola Peninsula further north. Essentially, if Russia wants to keep using the Arctic Circle as a natural deterrent to protect its nuclear weapons, while still positioning them close to European borders, Karelia is the only line of defense in a hypothetical land invasion. According to some analyses, plans to create and station the 44th Army Corps in Karelia began circulating in late 2022. The plans were formally established in 2024 under the Leningrad Military District and tied administratively to the Republic of Karelia. Its reported order of battle includes a 72nd Motor Rifle Division with multiple motor rifle regiments, plus a separate motor rifle brigade. Bloomsbury Intelligence and Security Institute, or BISI, a UK think tank, estimated that as many as 80,000 troops could eventually be stationed off Finland's border. That number, however, would almost certainly not be achievable until after the Ukraine war ends, when Russia finishes its purported military reforms. But the actual foundation of a military presence is there nonetheless. Satellite imagery from the region has also confirmed a significant air presence beyond the previous air bases. Ule has identified approximately 80 Su-35s and Su-27s belonging to the 159th Fighter Aviation Regiment at Petrozavodsk-Besovets Air Base, a unit that's been permanently stationed there for decades, but has recently drawn renewed attention amid increased military activity in the region. Imagery has also shown several Mi-24 Hind attack helicopters at the airfield, an older Soviet-era platform rather than a new system. Ule additionally reports roughly 10 radar stations at the garrison, which fits Russia's pattern of thickening air surveillance coverage along NATO's new eastern and northern frontier. This also plays into the aforementioned broader context of Karelia being a vital outpost to prevent Europe from accessing the Kola Peninsula. Now, a second project is underway in the Murmansk region, where Russia installed a new artillery brigade in June 2025 to support the formations along the Kola axis, again less than 100 miles away from Finland. Taken together, the two projects sketch out a longer-term Russian posture, where the goal is to deter NATO's presence in the area under the pretense of nuclear defense. As you may know, Russia has repeatedly changed its nuclear defense policy to the point where it's difficult to ascertain which events and attacks they consider a threat warranting a widespread nuclear response. At this rate, it's safe to say that Russia's nuclear assets are one of the major reasons the West has stood down when discussing a confrontation with Russia. If the Kremlin feels that its nuclear arsenal in Kola is reasonably threatened, it could launch a preemptive strike that could have unforeseen consequences for the world as a whole. So that's the defensive part of the Karelia reinforcement. But what about the offensive part? It turns out there's a major catch when it comes to actually manning the stations in the newly rebuilt complexes. The units associated with the 44th Army Corps are not sitting in Karelia waiting to be deployed. They've already been deployed to Ukraine. By May 2024, members of this unit were involved in Russia's northern push in Ukraine. Later, reporting placed the same corps near the Kursk axis. And by late 2024, units linked to the 44th Army Corps were confirmed to be involved in the fighting around Vovchansk during Russia's broader northern operation. So, it's safe to say that instead of the proposed Karelian defenses, which on paper would be used for strategic deterrence, Russia created a half-formed battalion that was, in actuality, just immediately fed to the same grinding attritional war that's already cost Russia over 1 million casualties by most credible estimates. What Russia is building, or trying to build, in Petrozavodsk right now is more than just combat-ready headquarters full of rested soldiers. It's basically scaffolding for a force that doesn't fully exist, yet. While the foundations might be there, the money it will require is being funneled into a project that might never get off the ground because the soldiers who would man them could be gone over the next few months with nobody to replace them. Russia also has several thousand Soviet-era armored vehicles, trucks and artillery systems in storage across the region. That sounds impressive until you remember what storage actually means in Russia. Some of it is genuinely recoverable, but a lot of it has been cannibalized for parts. Remember, Russia is burning through hundreds of tanks worth of equipment and parts in Ukraine each month, yet has limited capacities to manufacture new T-90s and retrofit older tanks. The math for long-term stationing simply doesn't work out. Now, if you want to stay current on Russia's military capacity and how it's holding up under the strain of the Ukraine war, make sure to subscribe to The Military Show. We cover the tempo of the war and how Russia is slowly being drained of vital resources, be it manpower, tanks, air forces, or simply intelligence and strategy. Back in Karelia, there's yet another problem with the Russia proposed garrisoning plan, having enough troops to man the facility. Building the actual stations and infrastructure is arguably the easiest part. Even supplying enough tanks and aircraft to maintain notable coverage is a relatively tame task. But sustaining the proposed meaningful fighting forces, which could number anywhere from 10,000 to 80,000 or even 100,000, is another matter entirely. You have to remember that all that equipment and soldiers need to have supplies brought in constantly, particularly given that Karelia is a relatively barren part of the country, only loosely connected to major population, industry, and agricultural centers. The fuel flow and railway throughput are actively going away from that part of the country. Russian railways have been refocused on supplying the actual war effort for the past 4 years. Building and supplying another active regiment is going to put additional strain on already strained systems. Then there's the matter of long-term maintenance. Beyond traditional upkeep requirements, Karelia has a sub-Arctic climate. Things break down faster in the cold, and the margin for error is much smaller. During the long and brutal winter, the supply chain is much more rigid and difficult to align with unexpected developments, such as the possibility of an actual NATO-Russia conflict. And this is where Russia's posturing starts to look less like strategy and more like a dare it cannot comfortably back up. Finland isn't just watching what Russia builds across the border, it's been answering it systematically and in ways that are harder to dismiss than a press release. Let's start with the fence. Finland is currently constructing a 124-mile fence along its border with Russia. While this is only a small part of the entire 800-mile border between the two countries, the full build is on track to be completed by the end of 2026. The fence is roughly 15 feet high, with metal railings topped by a meter of barbed wire, cameras, sensors, loudspeakers and lights. Finnish border guards suggest that the fence is designed to have surveillance cameras installed every 60 feet, with part of the barrier even extending underground. Of course, a fence with some cameras and wire won't be enough to stop a full-blown invasion by tanks and other heavy armor, but it's a clear indicator that Finland is spending a lot of effort in increasing surveillance of the border and creating early warning systems for both civilian and military infractions. Then there are the landmines. They're the most direct signal Finland has sent to Russia in years. In April 2025, Finland announced it was withdrawing from the Ottawa Convention banning anti-personnel landmines, citing Russia's long-term danger to all of Europe as the reason why. Finland formally presented the withdrawal proposal in July 2025, with the actual withdrawal beginning in January 2026. Finland's defense minister stated the decision was based on lessons drawn directly from Russia's tactics in Ukraine, where infantry operations at scale have made anti-personnel mines a central defensive tool. So, Finland went from destroying over 1 million landmines when it joined the Ottawa Convention in 2012 to reversing that decision in full. They weren't alone. Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania and Poland made the same move. In fact, the entire eastern NATO flank has collectively decided that the treaty no longer fits the threat environment. While there are no actual reports of Finland laying down minefields just yet, the mere possibility of them being planted along the border should make Russia think twice about overstepping its bounds. Finland is also hosting a new regional land forces command center opened in Mikkeli, roughly 90 miles from the Russian border. With an initial staff of around 10 officers, expected to eventually scale to 50, it's supposed to operate under NATO's Norfolk Command to coordinate allied land forces across northern Europe. The headquarters gives the alliance a permanent planning and coordination node inside Finnish territory, which is different from exercises and agreements. It means NATO can run joint planning, logistics, and command integration in peacetime so that in a crisis, those relationships already exist. The joint brigade formed with Sweden in September 2024 also adds to the ground defense component. The formation is built around Sweden's Norrbotten Mechanized Brigade, which is specifically trained for combat in harsh winter conditions and includes 5 battalions and support units. Swedish Archer 155mm howitzers have been positioned in Lapland, giving the brigade the ability to reach targets more than 30 miles away with precision fire and the ability to reposition in under a minute. An additional 5,000 to 7,000 Finnish troops will be permanently stationed alongside the brigade. With that, the combined force in Lapland roughly matches the number of Russian units currently deployed in the northern direction. Finland has also approved a NATO rail link through Sweden to Norway's Arctic port of Narvik. The rail connection will allow faster deployment of troops and heavy equipment and reduce Finland's dependence on Russian-gauge rail tracks. In a crisis, this means Allied reinforcements from across Scandinavia can reach Finnish Lapland by rail rather than waiting for air transport or road movement through difficult terrain. And in December 2025, Finland hosted the first ever Eastern Flank Summit in Helsinki, bringing together leaders of 8 EU countries on the EU's eastern edge. The gathering called for the EU's support in building credible and united defense capabilities along the border with Russia from north to south. Finland is actively organizing a response to the Russian buildup and pressing allies to speed up a strategic response. For their own part, Finland can mobilize 947,800 troops for wartime service, backed by a reserve of roughly 900,000 citizens. How? Well, they're one of the few countries with mandatory military service for all men, and one where the reserves stay integrated with the military throughout their working lives. Finland is also committed to raising its defense spending by 3% of GDP by 2029, up from 2.3% currently. It's a significant investment for a country that already punches well above its weight militarily. And Finland is also stocking up on equipment. In May 2024, Finland decided to purchase JASSM ER cruise missiles, which are long-range air-to-surface weapons. Pair those with Finland's incoming F-35 fleet, and Finland can target sensitive sites deep inside Russian territory in both Karelia and the Kola Peninsula. All of these point to Finland as a nation with decades of territorial defense doctrine built around the assumption that the threat is real, the weather will be bad, and every citizen should understand the stakes. The Finnish military has already gone to war with Russia, losing around 10% of its territory. It doesn't plan on letting that happen again. Then, in early March 2026, Finland confirmed its plan of lifting its long-standing ban on hosting nuclear weapons for NATO's eastern flank. While there's no confirmation on when actual nukes will be stationed inside the country, the mere possibility of having weapons located just 100 or so miles from Russia's border and nuclear arsenal should put Russia on edge. And it has. Just days after the nuclear weapon agreement, the Kremlin stated that this move would be a monumental mistake and attempted to influence NATO's internal decision-making by making the same saber-rattling arguments they've been using since February 2022. But the uncomfortable reality is that every time Russia positions forces near Finland, it inadvertently places more Russian assets within striking range of Finnish weapons. Building fixed infrastructure in Karelia basically hands Finland a predictable set of nodes to watch, index, and target. Every new depot, every vehicle park, every fresh barracks block is something Finnish and NATO intelligence can track continuously. Yet, somehow, Russia's illogical moves still add up to make political sense inside the Kremlin. When Finland joined NATO in April 2023, it handed Moscow a serious domestic problem. NATO's expansion alongside Russia's borders crossed the same line that Putin created to justify the war in Ukraine itself. So Russia did what it's always done when it felt cornered, posturing and militarizing in an attempt to sway public opinion to align with pre-existing values. Local Russian officials in Karelia had previously described the garrison buildup as a responsible task and promised that troops would bring families, economic life and services to the region. It's the classic garrison town pitch, where militarizing your backyard for your own good. The clinic will have substandard healthcare, but it will exist. Timing matters here too. Petrozavodsk looks like the kind of infrastructure investment you make when you believe the Ukraine war won't end quickly and you'll want strategic options in the 2027-2030 window. That aligns with broader European assessments that Russia will attempt to regenerate and reassert pressure after Ukraine. The new target might not necessarily be against Finland, but against the alliance's more vulnerable geographic seams like the Suwalki Gap or the Baltic approaches. But this creates even more opportunity for Russia to make huge mistakes in the long run. If it stretches its current resources too thin, it might mean Ukraine has more breathing room to continue its counter-offensive. Should that happen, Russia would fail on both fronts. And if the war in Ukraine doesn't end favorably, Putin loses legitimacy. If Putin doesn't send a clear signal to the Russian population that it's answering the supposed NATO threat, which was his modus operandi for decades now, then his propaganda machine slowly unravels and he's humiliated. That would be the true failure with the newest Russian military buildups. Why would you pressure an alliance you're not at war with when you're already losing badly in an actual war you started?
Putin is pushing NATO's buttons. After a 2025 that saw Russia ramp up its hybrid strategy throughout Western Europe, Putin just crossed a major line. Russia has targeted a French aircraft carrier in a brazen display of contempt. But what happened next humiliated Moscow. Russia was caught out, and all eyes are on the Kremlin as it tries to squirm out of accepting responsibility for a failed attack that has gone up in smoke. On February 26th, a drone took off from a Russian ship as the vessel made its approach to a very specific target that was in the port of Malmö, Sweden. That target was France's Charles de Gaulle aircraft carrier, which is currently in Sweden as part of a NATO operation that we'll discuss in more detail later. Russia's drone headed toward the carrier, forcing a scramble from NATO to disable it before it arrived. According to United 24 media, the Russian ship in question was a vessel named Zhigulevsk, which is part of Russia's Baltic fleet, and had been maneuvering around the Baltic Sea in the general vicinity of the Malmö port for some time. Sweden had been keeping tabs on the Zhigulevsk and had sent one of its Tapper-class patrol vessels, the HSWMS Rapp, to observe the vessel as it made its way through Baltic waters. In other words, Sweden saw all of this coming. Putin thought that his spy ship was being smart. However, what ended up happening is that Sweden watched Russia's drone launch, leaving no doubt as to who the culprit of the attack on the Charles de Gaulle was, and it has backed Russia into a corner. Putin can't claim that Russia didn't pull off this attack, but he'll try. As for the French carrier in question, the Charles de Gaulle would make for a very good target for Russia. That's why Putin ordered Russia's failed and humiliating drone attack. Russia is likely jealous that France even has an aircraft carrier that is capable of carrying up to 40 aircraft, especially after Russia was forced to take its only aircraft carrier out of commission in 2025 following literal decades of failure that ultimately led to the carrier becoming a lame duck. Russia wanted to send a message with this attack and thought that the message had gotten through, and we'll cover what that means toward the end of the video. It's a message that has been marred by the utter failure of Russia to cover its tracks. Russia was caught red-handed from the off, and what Sweden did in response capped the humiliation off for Putin and his cronies. According to The Telegraph, the Swedish military intercepted Russia's drone long before it even made it close to the Charles de Gaulle. The drone was confronted about 6 miles offshore, not by Swedish or NATO fighter jets, but by a jamming operation that sent the drone packing. The ultimate fate of the drone is unknown. It may have been forced to turn back and head to the Zhigulevsk in disgrace, or it crashed out into the water miles away from Malmö. Either way, what we see here is an attempt by Russia to either launch an attack or conduct surveillance against a French aircraft carrier that has crashed and burned before it ever had the chance of truly getting off the ground. The BBC also reported on Russia's failed attack, noting that several key figures have highlighted Russia's drone incursion for what it is, a ridiculous provocation. Those were the words used by France's Foreign Minister Jean-Noël Barrot, who was on board the Charles de Gaulle when the attack happened. If indeed there is a potential Russian origin for this incident, the only conclusion I would draw is that it would be a ridiculous provocation, Barrot said. Sweden's Prime Minister, Ulf Kristersson, who was also on board the French carrier, said that the entire incident was serious, though not especially unexpected, and that even without Russia being caught red-handed, everybody would have known who was behind the attack. It's a Russian way of acting that we recognize from other places, Kristersson noted. This time it's a Russian way of acting that has fallen flat on its face. Though it's clear that Russia targeting the Charles de Gaulle is supposed to be some sort of strategic signal, the fact that its drone only managed to travel for about a mile before it was jammed into oblivion tells us that Russia's latest hybrid tactic was overcooked. It also tells us that NATO is ready for what Russia has spent the last few years doing, and that Sweden, at the very least, has the sort of electronic equipment needed to stop Russia's drones in their tracks. The Charles de Gaulle remains untouched. Sweden was so successful with its interception of Russia's drone that nobody on board would have even known it had happened if Sweden hadn't publicized it. As for Russia, do you remember earlier when we told you that there was no way the Kremlin can try to weasel out of taking responsibility for what it's just done? Well, more fool us, because that's precisely what Russia is trying to do. According to a February 27th report in the Moscow Times, the Kremlin has rejected all Swedish claims that Russia launched a drone at the Charles de Gaulle. Putin's favorite mouthpiece, Dmitry Peskov, labeled Sweden's claims as quite an absurd statement when asked about what had happened, and he went as far as to claim that Russia has no information about the drone incident. Of course it doesn't, Dmitry. Why would Russia want to say anything more about an attempted attack that was so brazen that a Swedish patrol boat crew literally watched Russia's drone launch from a Russian ship? After all, the Kremlin has a clear motive for sending the drone, as we'll cover in a few moments. As for Sweden, though it is clearly pointing the finger at Russia, it's still going about this incident methodically. It has outlined precisely what happened, with one of the country's armed forces spokespeople noting, "A ship from the Swedish Navy observed a suspicious drone during a maritime patrol in the Strait of Öresund. In connection with the observation, the armed forces took countermeasures to disrupt the suspected drone. Contact with the drone was subsequently lost." This is a blunt and to-the-point message delivered to Russia that basically tells Putin that he tried and failed with his intimidation tactics. And now that the attack on the Charles de Gaulle is done, Sweden has announced the launch of an investigation into the entire incident under its Tillträdesförordningen, which is the Swedish law that governs the access that foreign ships have to the country's waters. So Sweden is being clear about how it intends to deal with Russia. The drone was taken out, and an investigation is underway that could lead to Russia's spy ship being in even more trouble. Sweden is also telling Putin that it saw all of this coming. On February 17th, just a week or so before the attack on the Charles de Gaulle, Thomas Nilsson, who is the head of Sweden's military intelligence, said the country had observed Russia as it stepped up its hybrid warfare campaign. Nilsson noted that Russia was constantly developing its capabilities and was ready to take greater risks and use them, including what I call advanced sabotage, including assassination plots, serious arson, and attacks on critical societal infrastructure. In other words, what Russia tried to do so brazenly with the Charles de Gaulle came as no surprise to Sweden's military intelligence. It saw all of this coming. That's likely why there was already a patrol boat deployed to watch the Zhigulevsk as it tried to prowl through the Baltic waters. And it's why Sweden shut down Russia's attack so quickly that it may as well have never happened. Still, Nilsson's points about Russia's ramping up of its hybrid strategy stand and deserve further exploration, so stick with us until the end, where we'll explore what Russia is doing and what it all means. But while we're on this, you are watching The Military Show. If you haven't subscribed yet, now is the perfect time to hit that button. Before we get to what Russia is doing and what it all means, there's the reason behind its attempt to send a drone to the Charles de Gaulle that we mentioned earlier in the video. You may have questions about a French aircraft carrier even being in Sweden in the first place. A little logic will tell you that the presence of the carrier in Malmö port probably has something to do with NATO, and you'd be right. The Charles de Gaulle is taking part in an operation that has a direct impact on Russia. Of course, NATO isn't going on the attack or anything like that, but what it is doing is conducting the Lafayette 26 mission in and around Sweden. That entire mission, which will include exercises conducted in the Baltic Sea where the Zhigulevsk operates, has been designed by NATO as a multinational exercise where it will focus on deterring the threats presented to undersea cables. That's a clear message to Russia. Part of the hybrid campaign that Russia has launched involves sending spy ships to find the locations of these cables, which are critical for communication, and in some cases attempting to sever them. Back in December 2024, Finland even detained a Russian vessel as part of an investigation into an incident of cable severing, which is a sort of problem that makes Lafayette 26 such a vital mission. Beyond the cables, the United States Naval Institute says that Lafayette 26 has also been designed to help France and NATO boost their defense and deterrent posture against Russia, in addition to fostering collaboration between France and its NATO allies, along with strengthening Europe's borders. None of this is anything that Putin wants to see, and he especially didn't want to see the Charles de Gaulle in Sweden, as Lafayette 26 marks the first time that the carrier has journeyed to the country. What Russia is dealing with here is a display of NATO power that also targets some of the hybrid tactics and border incursions that Russia has been using to disrupt European NATO. So Russia sent a spy ship and launched a drone from it to keep an eye on what was happening. Putin thought he was being sneaky, but he was humiliated instantly. Both the ship and the drone were spotted and have been dealt with, and Russia is going to be none the wiser about what happens during Lafayette 26, outside of what NATO shows Russia as part of its power projection tactics. Russia has egg on its face after February 26th. However, that doesn't mean that what we saw on that day wasn't a dangerous sign of both things to come and of Russia's desire to maintain its hybrid warfare campaign against NATO. That brings us back to something we mentioned earlier about Russia ramping up its hybrid warfare campaign. And this latest attack is, at the very least, a sign that Russia is getting bolder with its strategies. After all, it came during the same week that the Telegraph revealed that Russia has been sending migrants to European countries via a network of underground tunnels that stretch between Poland and Belarus. Those tunnels have already been used by almost 200 migrants to cross into the European Union or EU territory, and Polish officials believe that they were constructed by Middle Eastern specialists, likely as part of Russia's attempts to destabilize European nations by using migration as a weapon. The Henry Jackson Society highlights Russia's plan in a November 2025 piece, where it says that Russia is pushing desperate migrants toward EU nations, and when those nations refuse to take the growing swell of migrants in, the Kremlin attacks those countries for being intolerant to the needs of others. The migrants themselves aren't the aggressors, they are Putin's pawns, instruments that he uses to carry out Russian aggression through tactics that are designed to harm the EU and NATO members while still remaining under the threshold of a conventional war. It's a classic Russian propaganda play. And it, along with the attack on the Charles de Gaulle, showcases how varied Russia's hybrid warfare strategy has become. According to a February 20th piece by The Record, Dutch intelligence has also highlighted just how much Russia has been escalating its hybrid warfare approach. In addition to drones and migrants, Russia is also using a heady mix of cyber attacks, disinformation, espionage, sabotage, and hidden political influence to destabilize the nations that Putin believes present the biggest threat to the Russian vision for a version of Europe that, for all intents and purposes, would look something like it did back when the Soviet Union was in its prime. A sharp rise in these sorts of activities has been seen in Europe since 2023, the record says, and it notes that Russia is internally trying to frame what it's doing as a fight against what Dutch intelligence says Russia calls a decadent West and a unique Russian Federation that is only concerned with its own survival. There you have it then. It's well known that nations that are just trying to survive start brutal multi-year wars against other countries. That's the survival instinct in action. Powerful countries attack those that they perceive as weaker just so they can keep going. Sarcasm aside, the Russian framing of what the country is doing is all nonsense. However, it's what Putin and his cronies are using to justify their attacks against NATO, the EU, and countries that were formerly part of the Soviet bloc, such as Ukraine. And the worrying thing for the West is that this all implies that Putin is being driven, or at least pretending to be driven, by an ideology rather than a simple desire for conquest. Ideologues are always difficult to dissuade due to their blind adherence to their own philosophy, which ultimately means that the already escalated hybrid warfare that Russia is conducting is only going to get worse. We'll return to that idea in a minute or two. First, let's come back to how Russia launched its drone at the Charles de Gaulle. At first glance, this seems like a unique way for Russia to launch a drone attack. After all, the Ukraine war has shown us that Russia can launch these drones from almost anywhere on its own territory, which raises the question of why it would send a ship into Baltic waters to do the job. One of the answers to that question might be that Russia's drones aren't capable of traveling to Sweden. That's certainly a possibility, though drones like Russia's Geran 2 can travel between 1,800 and 2,500 kilometers, or around 1,120 to 1,550 miles, which means they could reach Sweden if launched from the right location in Russia. A far more likely answer, though, is that Russia wanted to launch from a ship because it's a strategy that it's used before to send a message to the West. The difference this time is that Russia used a spy ship that is part of its military's navy, rather than the Shadow Fleet ships that it's used in the past. Both The Guardian and the Kyiv Independent have reported on Russia's use of Shadow Fleet ships for what its spy ships are now apparently doing. Back in September, the latter noted that Shadow Fleet oil tankers were being used as launch and control points for drones that Russia was sending into the airspace of European cities. The Guardian's report said the same thing and carried a quote from Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky, who said, "Currently, Russians are using tankers not only to earn money for the war, but also for reconnaissance and even sabotage activities. What we saw on February 26th was different." With the Shadow Fleet, Russia already has a massive collection of ships that numbers roughly 1,468, according to the BBC and tankertrackers.com. If Russia is now bringing legitimate military naval assets into the mix, the humiliation of its February 26th attack on the Charles de Gaulle is compounded. A spy ship failed to do what Shadow Fleet tankers have been doing for months. Still, even with that failure, the fact that Russia used a warship instead of a civilian vessel in this latest attack demonstrates that things are indeed only going to get worse in the hybrid war that Russia is waging. Russia may be stepping out of the grey zone. Unsuccessfully, we might add, but still, Russia using a spy ship to target the Charles de Gaulle suggests that the country is taking a step closer to moving away from using tactics that are below the threshold of war and into tactics that lead to a much more conventional confrontation. This is all part of the Russian plan, at least according to a February 5th report by the Belfer Center. That organization predicts that the next 3 years will see Russia gradually escalate its grey zone campaign until it reaches the point where it's ready to conduct a military incursion into NATO's northeastern flank. That excursion might see Russia try to seize a border area on NATO's northeastern flank in a flash attack, with Putin's goal likely being to take advantage of the confusion that results to fortify in whatever that border region might be as NATO members try to organize their response. This is worrying for NATO and the future of Europe. A jammed drone launched at an aircraft carrier is indeed an incident that has seen Russia fail. It's humiliating for Putin, but it's also not the last of this sort of thing that we're going to see. If the Belfer Center is correct, the hybrid campaign is only going to get worse from here. Russia is going to become more direct with its threats and hybrid attacks. It's going to keep doing things like using its military assets to threaten NATO's northeastern flank. On February 26th, Sweden was a step ahead of Putin. NATO as a collective needs to make sure that it follows the lead of one of its newest members. Russia's humiliation is a sign of what's to come. NATO has to be ready for much more. In the wake of the Russian attack on the Charles de Gaulle, NATO has already heightened surveillance in the Baltic Sea and intensified maritime and coastal monitoring. These are good steps, but we would argue that they can't be temporary. NATO must meet each of Russia's hybrid escalations with escalations of its own to send back a clear message to the Kremlin as it tries to talk tough through its actions. NATO sees what Putin is doing, and it will stop everything that Russia tries in its tracks. There's also an argument to be made that the attack on the Charles de Gaulle was personal for Putin.
Estonia has just come out swinging as tensions reach the boiling point and concerns over Putin's plans for the Baltic rage. Estonia has announced that it plans to burn Moscow to the ground. Even the US is shocked by the brutal plan that Estonia has in store for Russia. However, it's a plan that will only be triggered if Putin does one very stupid and unforgivable thing first: invade. During a conversation held on the sidelines of the Munich Security Conference in mid-February, Estonia's Foreign Minister Margus Tsahkna made the shocking revelation that his country is preparing to do much more than defend itself against Russia if And when the time comes, Estonia is going to fight hard. "We'll bring the war to Russia, and we'll have very deep strikes very far into Russia," Tsahkna said, adding that Estonia knows exactly what to do in the case of a Russian invasion. Reading between the lines, this tells us that Estonia has a full-fledged military plan that it will enact as soon as a single Russian soldier crosses the border. It's a plan that involves hitting Russia on its own turf. We'll explore that plan a little later in the video, but for now, Tsahkna adds that Estonia is doing everything that it can to make sure that Putin knows how much of a threat a country that is much smaller in stature than Russia can pose. That's why we are now speeding up our investments and developing our capabilities, the Estonian foreign minister says of the country's plans, adding that it's why we're investing 5% of GDP on defense in our region. Estonia has talked about Putin's plotting for a Baltic takeover many times before, but this is different. This is Estonia telling Putin that it won't just be defending against Russia's invading troops. The country will come out swinging hard, and Russia may well regret crossing the one line that could end up bringing all of NATO on its doorstep. As the Kyiv Post notes, Tsahkna made his comments as tensions rise throughout Europe over Russia seemingly trying to push NATO boundaries. 2025 alone offered plenty of examples, as Russia intensified the hybrid war that it's been waging in Europe for years. Drones were sent into the airspace of several NATO-aligned nations, including Poland and Romania. Estonia itself was on the receiving end of Putin's boundary pushing. In September, Russia sent a trio of MiG-31 fighter jets into Estonia's airspace. They lingered for 12 minutes while ignoring all requests to communicate before finally being shooed away by a NATO rapid response team. Incidents like these aren't meant to signal attacks. They are examples of Russia testing response times, of Russia trying to figure out how long it has to conduct strikes before it faces retaliation, and Estonia knows exactly what Putin is trying to pull. And as all of these hybrid warfare tactics have been implemented, Russia has also been openly preparing for a more traditional war with Europe that seems destined to focus on the Baltic region. For instance, Russia is building up its bases and troop deployments along the border that it shares with Finland, the Kyiv Post reports. It's also increasingly militarizing the exclave of Kaliningrad, which is sandwiched between Poland and Lithuania, which could make it the launching pad for a multi-directional push in the Baltic region. And an attack from Kaliningrad from the west and Russia itself from the east could end up being enough to shut the Baltic states off from their NATO support. That's why Estonia is ready to strike back. It needs to be able to hit Russia hard enough to hold Putin's marauding forces at bay long enough for its NATO allies to respond. Plenty of questions remain about what Estonia's response to Russia could look like and whether the responses will even work, but we'll get to answering those questions later. First, the most important thing to know about Tsahkna's comments is that this isn't the case of him saying Estonia is preparing to invade Russia as a preemptive attack on a country that plans to invade its territory. This is a counterpunch, not a one-hitter-quitter. Estonia is letting Russia know that Putin can't and won't have everything go his own way if he pulls the trigger on a European campaign that many believe he is plotting to start in the wake of the Ukraine war, which Russia is still a long way away from winning. In its report on Tsahkna's comments, The Telegraph reports that they were made amidst concerns circulating in defense circles that Russia plans to at least partially occupy the Baltic states of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania once the Ukraine war ends. Of course, that plan assumes that Russia wins in Ukraine, which is far from a given after 4 years of fighting in which it's only occupied about 20% of the country. But the concern is there, and it's not just a concern that circulates in Baltic circles. Back in December, Kirillo Budanov, who was then the head of Ukraine's military intelligence but is now the head of the office of the president of Ukraine, claimed that Russia has started to shorten its timeframes for a potential occupation of European territory. Budanov claimed that the Baltic states would be the first on the Russian checklist when that fighting begins, and he noted that Putin's own diabolical ambitions are the fuel that drives everything. For an empire, and they see themselves as an empire, to develop, you always have to move somewhere to expand your influence and territory. That, by the way, answers many questions, Budanov said in December. To Putin, that likely means that Russia would want to get what he perceives as the weakest European nations under his control before he turns his attention to nations like Poland, for which Budanov says that Russia currently has no military plans. That's a strange revelation in its own right. We just mentioned Kaliningrad and the role it would likely play in an attack on the Baltic states. Does Putin really think that Poland wouldn't respond to aggression being conducted by what is ostensibly a neighbor against several of its NATO allies? If so, Russia is taking a remarkably short-sighted approach to the concept of an invasion of Estonia and the other Baltic states, perhaps because it believes the rest of Europe will be willing to sacrifice them to Putin's empire-building ambitions. That isn't the case. Estonia is relying on that fact. Plenty of others believe that a Russian strike in Europe is coming. including Ian Bond, who is the deputy director of the Centre for European Reform. Bond tells the BBC, "Nobody in their right mind wants to think that a European war is around the corner again, but the reality is an increasing number of European intelligence officials have been telling us that. The time frame doesn't really matter as much as the assessment itself, and there have been concerns that the Baltic states will be Putin's first target since way back in 2018. That's when the Center for a New American Security published a piece starkly entitled, 'When Putin Invades the Baltics,' in which it said that Russia's president was playing a vast chess game against NATO and that invading Estonia, Lithuania and Latvia would be his next move. We now know that the center was wrong, as Putin struck against Ukraine first. But what all this tells us is that Russia's leader has been ruminating on how the Russian Federation could retake control of former Soviet territories for years. If Estonia is correct, Putin's scheming and plotting are almost done, and the time for Russia to take action is drawing near. All of this brings us back to something that we mentioned earlier, what Estonia's plan to burn Russia to the ground would actually look like. Estonia has certainly been doing plenty to prepare for a Russian invasion, as we'll go into in a moment. But the first thing that Russia needs to know is that Estonia is far from the nation that it was when talk of a potential invasion started surfacing. Sagner hinted at that when talking about the country's defense investments, and he makes it very clear in more statements that he delivered at the Munich Security Conference. The previous plans of the past were just, if Russia is coming, then NATO finally will win the war. In that case, no Estonians will be left, but we're not interested about these kinds of plans, Estonia's foreign minister explains, with perhaps a tinge of bitterness that previous plans to defeat Russia essentially amounted to sacrificing Estonia so that the rest of European NATO could survive. A counter-invasion is our plan, because there is no other plan. We cannot let Russia into the Baltic states and only then fight back, Sagner adds, which tells you all you need to know about his mindset. Logically, there is a clear problem with what Estonia intends to do. In a one-on-one fight, Russia overpowers Estonia even after 4 years of war with Ukraine. As global firepower, which ranks the world's military nations based on strength of land, air and sea, points out, Russia still has the second strongest military in the world based on its metrics. Estonia ranks number 106 out of 145 assessed nations, and there is no single area where it comes out on top against Russia. Estonia's entire population of almost 1.2 million people is smaller than the 1.3 million active personnel that Russia has in its military alone. Russia's defense budget is about 100 times higher than Estonia's, and that money goes toward funding an air force that has 4,237 assets compared to Estonia's 2, and a navy with a fleet strength of 747 assets versus the 8 warships that Estonia has. Even on the ground, Global Firepower says that Estonia has no tanks and only 2,507 armoured vehicles, which will make it incredibly difficult for the country to defend itself against Putin's favoured methods of assault. Those numbers make Sagner's talk of an invasion into Russian territory seem crazy. Remember what he said about deep strikes. Estonia wouldn't be looking to send soldiers into Russia. That would be almost impossible when Russia has enough soldiers to essentially form a blockade around the entire country to prevent anybody from breaking through. But what Estonia can do, and it's likely learned this from Ukraine, is strike Russia in the deep rear to cripple the advance of the soldiers on the ground. For a start, Estonia has purchased a dozen HIMARS rocket systems from the United States, and is pushing ahead with plans to buy at least 6 more units, assuming that the HIMARS manufacturer, Lockheed Martin, is able to get permission from the Pentagon to produce them. Those new HIMARS would arrive in Estonia by 2028 or 29, and they will provide the country with the capacity to launch deep strikes into Russian territory. We've seen Ukraine prove that HIMARS is up for that particular job several times during its war with Russia. For example, September 28th brought with it the news that Ukraine had carried out a successful HIMARS strike against a thermal power plant in the Belgorod Oblast. Estonia happens to border Russia directly, and it's very possible the HIMARS systems that it already has and those that it intends to buy could be pointed in the direction of the St. Petersburg region, placing one of Russia's most important population centers at risk. St. Petersburg also happens to be one of the more affluent regions of Russia, which means that Putin would want to shield it from the horrors of the war that he wants to wage. Estonia could ensure that shielding doesn't happen by delivering a quick reminder that Russia can be hit hard if any of the country's soldiers cross the line. Adding to the HIMARS threat is Estonia's incoming batch of 6 South Korean K239 Chunmoo multiple launch rocket systems. That order was announced by Estonia in December as part of a €290 million or $342 million contract, and there are missiles included in the deal that strengthen Estonia's long-range capabilities. Chief among them is the CTM-90, which is a tactical ballistic missile that has a range of up to 290 kilometers or about 180 miles. Again, that puts various parts of the St. Petersburg region at risk. Estonia will also be receiving CTM-MR and CGR-080 missiles, which have ranges of 160 and 80 kilometers or 99.4 and 49.7 miles respectively. The longer-range missile of the two would present an obvious threat to the Russian regions that border Estonia, while the shorter-ranged missile could be used to strike the Russian rear in occupied Estonia should it be needed. Deliveries of these South Korean systems will begin during the second half of 2027, Militani reports. And what these deliveries prove is that Estonia is getting its hands on some muscle to back up the comments made by its foreign minister. Deep strikes are indeed possible, and Estonia will be using them to strike Russian territory as it defends itself on the ground. And that's where the second part of Ukraine's strategy comes into play. As important as these types of deep strike weapons will be in demonstrating to Putin that Estonia can't be pushed around, they will ultimately be part of a wider strategy that sees Estonia holding on for long enough for it to receive support from its NATO allies. The second that Russian forces try to invade, Estonia will look to trigger Article 5 of the NATO Charter. Under that article, all NATO members are duty-bound to come to the aid of any individual member that is subject to an attack on its territory. An often underreported aspect of Article 5 is that this aid may or may not involve the use of armed force, but in Estonia's case it will be relying on nations like its Baltic neighbours of Lithuania and Latvia, along with those in the Baltic-adjacent regions such as Finland and Poland, being so spooked by Putin's power play they will respond by fighting alongside Estonia on its own turf. Estonia's challenge is that triggering Article 5 doesn't amount to an immediate NATO response. It takes time to organise a war with Russia, after all. So on top of the deep strikes, Estonia has pledged spending more than 10 billion euros, or about $11.8 billion, on its military between 2026 and 2029. The idea is to create a credible deterrent, which Estonia plans to do via a remodelled version of the Estonian Defence Forces that will have access to more modern weapons, larger stocks of ammunition, and advanced training. In other words, Estonia refuses to be and also ran in a NATO war with Russia. It's trying to be a heavy hitter. Estonia is also building up its defences. According to the Kyiv Post, the country has recently passed legislation that requires all apartment and office buildings of a certain size to include bunkers and bomb shelters, likely as a proactive step toward dealing with inevitable Russian missile and drone strikes if Putin invades. Estonia has also completed 110 kilometers, or about 68 miles, of a fence that will run along its eastern border with Russia, which it will use to hold up the Russian forces and conduct surveillance, so it knows when Putin plans to attack. Add to all of that the country's proposed upgrades to drone capabilities and air defences, and it's clear that Estonia has taken many of the lessons that it's learned from Ukraine's fight against Russia, and is now planning to use them in its own defence. There is one obvious question to ask after all of this: will Estonia's plan work? It will, in the sense that the country would be able to give Russia a nasty, bloody nose in a response to Putin's invasion. Missiles flying into St. Petersburg are enough for that, and Estonia's response may just be strong enough to anger the affluent citizens of that region into pressuring Putin into rethinking his approach. But in the long term, Estonia would still be heavily reliant on its NATO allies to work alongside it to develop a coordinated defence. The numbers shared by global firepower don't lie, and the great concern for Estonia is that NATO may not be the big answer. A worrying simulation highlights that. Reported on by The Telegraph, the so-called Lithuanian simulation was organised by the German news outlet Die Welt, and it featured former NATO members and German military analysts. Under this hypothetical war game, Die Welt concluded that NATO's members would be so paralysed by indecision over what they should do if Russia invaded Lithuania that the invasion would be all but done by the time a response was organised. The big headline from the simulation is the American role in the whole thing, as the experts Die Welt used suggested that the US would avoid triggering or providing aid as part of Article 5 over fears that doing so would trigger a Third World War. Even Germany, which has soldiers stationed in Lithuania, would apparently be unable to stop Putin's forces. This is a doomsday scenario. And though it focuses on Lithuania, Estonia is a fellow Baltic state that faces many of the same challenges. However, it's important to note that Die Welt's scenario is just that, one possible future among many, and a future that relies heavily on the assumption that the US would just sit back and allow Estonia to be toppled. That's far from a given. Still, Estonia has just made it clear that it's getting ready for any situation. It would prefer not to fight. The country's president, Alar Karis, is even among several European leaders who are calling for Europe to appoint an envoy who can communicate with Putin. That hasn't happened yet, and there are big question marks over whether Putin would speak to such an envoy, and whether his words could be trusted if he did. So Estonia has its plan. It'll hit Russia as hard as it can to send a shock through Putin's system, so strong that it would surprise everybody. And Estonia may need to do just that.
Russian President Vladimir Putin has an insatiable appetite for power. Even if his forces continue to capture land in Ukraine or negotiate a deal that allows them to take full control of certain territories, he'll never stop wanting more, and he'll always have fresh new targets in his sights. And several experts believe they've already identified the next location in Putin's campaign of conquest: Narva, a border city in Estonia with a fascinating past and uncertain future. Fortunately, Estonia is already well aware of the importance Narva holds and the reality of the risks it faces, and is taking all available steps to prepare the city for a possible Russian invasion. On the face of it, Narva, Estonia's third largest city with a population of approximately 54,000 people, may not seem like an obvious target for Russia's forces to attack. Scratch the surface and dig a little deeper, however, and you can start to see the many reasons why Putin could eventually decide to lay claim to this city. Those reasons revolve around Narva's past, present, population, location, and even its economy. To understand them, it's first important to look back at how this city was formed and the interesting changes and events it's endured over the years. Because Narva's history goes back a long way. In fact, people first settled in this area thousands of years ago, and the oldest known settlement in the area, Narva Oru, dates all the way back to 1000 BC, making it the oldest in all of Estonia. The Narva Castle, also known as the Herman Castle, was constructed in 1256 during the Danish rule of northern Estonia. However, the city of Narva itself was first officially recognized as a city in 1329. The castle's foundations were laid in an ideal location at the intersection of several trade routes and besides the rushing waters of the Narva River, and the surrounding settlement soon began to develop. This all occurred at a time when Denmark ruled over northern Estonia, but Narva experienced numerous changes in ownership in the centuries that followed. During the Livonian War of the 16th century, for example, the Tsardom of Russia managed to capture the city, turning it temporarily into an important trading port and transshipment center for Russian goods from nearby Russian cities, such as Novgorod and Pskov. This was Russia's first, but not last involvement in the history of Narva, and it didn't last long. Just a couple of decades after the Tsardom had seized the city, it was conquered all over again, this time by the troops of the Kingdom of Sweden. Russia tried and failed to retake the area, but Sweden managed to hold it for more than a century, contributing greatly to Narva's development during that time. Under Swedish rule, the Baroque old town of Narva was built, for example. And even after a fire ravaged large parts of the city in 1659, old structures were soon replaced, fueled by the increasing trade income the city enjoyed. Sweden also sought to improve the city's defensive structures, constructing a strong system of special fortifications called bastions, which were soon regarded as some of the very best in all of Europe. But Russia always kept a close eye on the city and was desperate to reclaim it by any means necessary. Thus, during the Battle of Narva in 1700, the city was the site of the first great battle between Russian and Swedish forces, with Russia eventually conquering and claiming Narva in 1704. Russia then continued to hold the city well into the 20th century, and Narva continued to grow and prosper, becoming the most important industrial city in all of Estonia, home of the country's first railway and various big businesses. The Second World War proved to be a major turning point in the city's remarkable history. It was taken over by Nazi forces, with the Soviet Red Army eventually being forced to bombard the area, destroying its old town and 98% of its buildings. The Soviet authorities subsequently decided not to rebuild any of the beautiful old buildings that had been destroyed, and also refused to allow the city's original native inhabitants to return to their home. Instead, traditional Soviet apartment blocks were built, and Russian-speaking workers were funneled into the area from various parts of the USSR, turning what had once been a hub of Estonian culture, language, and traditions into a bland and largely Russian-speaking city, similar in atmosphere and aesthetics to so many of others across the Soviet Union. In 1991, the Union collapsed, and Estonia at last regained its independence. But Narva has continued to be home to a large number of Russian speakers and citizens. In this respect, it bears at least some similarity with the Ukrainian region of Crimea, as well as the eastern regions of Ukraine that Putin originally targeted in his 2022 invasion, like Donetsk and Luhansk. For that reason, ever since Russia annexed Crimea in early 2014, fears have gradually risen that the Kremlin could carry out a similar assault on Narva. Various political commentators, journalists, scientists, and military experts have even coined the concept of the so-called NARVA scenario, a hypothetical military situation in which Russia attacks one of the small NATO nations, like Estonia, using hybrid warfare tactics similar to those seen in 2014 and the build-up to the 2022 invasion. As the war in Ukraine rumbles on, many of those same experts are sounding the alarm, suggesting that the NARVA scenario is becoming increasingly realistic as Putin weighs up his next move and designates the next target for his enormous and ever-expanding army to focus on. Speaking to The Sun, for example, Tim Willesee, a former diplomat and visiting professor of war studies at King's College, warned that Putin's plans for European conquest are far from over. "I don't think for a moment that Putin's project is finished." The expert went on to argue that no matter how the war in Ukraine goes, and even if it comes to an end through some sort of potential peace agreement, the Russian president is already eyeing up additional targets. The one I've always thought is very dangerous is Narva, which has an 80% Russian population. He's not the only one warning that Narva might be next in line for the Kremlin's war machine, and locals have reason to worry, as Putin himself even issued a vague threat towards the city back in 2022. While meeting with young entrepreneurs, engineers and scientists at the Moscow People's Economy Accomplishment Exhibition's Innovation and Education Center, Putin famously compared himself with Russia's legendary Emperor Peter the Great, while claiming that Russia had always held dominion over the Estonian city. Peter I waged the Great Northern War for 21 years. It appeared as if he was fighting with Sweden, conquered something. He didn't conquer anything, he took back. That's how it is, in the western direction, meaning Narva, his first invasions. Why did he go there? He took back and secured. That's what he did. Putin went on to say that modern Russians should follow that example, taking back and securing whatever locations they feel belong to them. Alarm bells have been ringing ever since, and it's not hard to see why. There are arguably 5 major reasons Putin could point to as some sort of justification for attacking the Estonian city. The first reason, as Putin himself has pointed out, is Russia's historic ties to Narva. As explained earlier on, Russia has at various times throughout its history held control over this city. The same can be said for various cities across Europe and all across the ages. We've seen different countries, dominions and empires lay claim to varying cities, towns and territories. These days, however, the vast majority of nations around the world respect each other's independence and sovereignty. They don't lay claim to others' countries' territories purely because they owned them in the past. Russia, or at least its leader, tends to see things differently. For Moscow, it appears that any location which has ever been partially occupied by Russian or Soviet forces or people throughout history is fair game to be targeted in the 21st century. This, after all, is partly how Putin has explained his so-called special military operation in Ukraine, arguing that the Donbas region of eastern Ukraine should belong to Russia, while also laying claim to Crimea, and even at one point stating that all of Ukraine is, in his view, Russia's to take. So, it's not difficult to imagine Putin making similar arguments in regard to Narva, given the city's unique history and modern-day associations with Russia. Which leads us on to the second big reason: Narva's vast number of Russian citizens, Russian language speakers, and its cultural connections with Russia as a whole. As Mr. Willesee notes, Narva has a large percentage of Russian citizens living within its boundaries. Exact numbers are hard to come by, and estimates vary, though recent numbers state that the 6% of the city's population are ethnic Estonians. Less than half, around 48% to be exact, are Estonian citizens, while 36% have Russian passports, and 14% fall into the category of undefined citizenship. 97% of the city's population speak Russian, and many are believed to maintain close ties with the country. Indeed, shortly after Estonia acquired its independence in the early 1990s, an unofficial referendum was held regarding the future of Narva and the surrounding areas. Polls at the time suggested that the vast majority of people in those areas opposed secession from Estonia, but the referendum results showed that 97% voted in favour of autonomy despite a mere 55% turnout among Narva residents. Russia can still point to that referendum as a sign that the people of Narva do not wish to be part of Estonia, though there were numerous credible reports of vote rigging at the time. And the vote was ultimately deemed unconstitutional by the Estonian government, with many believing that Moscow had interfered to influence the result. Still, Putin rarely lets facts or the truth interfere with his agenda, and could easily construct a narrative to argue that Narva's people want and need to become part of Russia. The city's mayor, Katri Rake, would strongly disagree. Speaking to the photojournalist Mario Heller for a Chatham House report, Rake argues that Russian soil is mere meters away from Narva's city centre, and if any local residents really wanted to become Russian, they don't have far to travel, yet very few actually decide to make the journey. Anyone who wants to can move to Russia any time, but no one does because everyone knows that Estonia is a free country. The third reason Russia may see Narva as an attractive target is its location. The Russia-Estonia border extends for 183 miles, 294 kilometers in total. So, theoretically, if Russia wanted to invade Estonia and launch an assault on this small NATO nation, it could choose numerous locations along that line. However, when we look at the border more closely, it's clear to see that Russia's options are limited, as many miles of the border run not across land, but across bodies of water, like the Narva Reservoir, the Narva River itself, and the vast Lake Peipus, which is the largest transboundary lake in all of Europe and the fifth biggest lake in Europe overall, covering a whopping 1,373 square miles or 3,555 square kilometers. Getting a large invasion force, including tanks, armoured vehicles, artillery and other assets, across a massive lake or reservoir is an extremely challenging task. As such, any Russian invasion of Estonia would have to be orchestrated along the land-based sections of the border, making Narva the most obvious target. There is still the Narva River to cross here, but there's already a large bridge connecting the Estonian city to its Russian neighbour, Ivangorod. However, the bridge was closed by Estonian authorities and will remain shut until the war in Ukraine ends. The Estonian side has also installed gates and barriers to enhance security. Russia could also make use of the large E20 highway, which runs all the way to the Estonian capital of Tallinn in the west, connecting it directly to the major Russian city of St. Petersburg to the east. This would be ideal for the Kremlin's forces to transport troops and military vehicles towards Narva quickly and efficiently. From a logistical perspective, therefore, an invasion of Narva wouldn't necessarily be too difficult for Moscow to organise. There is, however, one big question mark around any assault on Narva, and that's the fact that Estonia is part of the NATO alliance. And all members of the NATO alliance are obligated to defend one another in case of any attack or invasion. And this leads us on to the fourth reason Russia might try to attack. Putin may believe that Narva is simply not significant enough to trigger a wide-scale NATO response, and some experts fear that this argument holds weight. In his Sun interview, for example, Willesee expressed concern that the US and potentially other major NATO nations wouldn't be all that willing to possibly provoke a global conflict or full-scale war with Russia purely to save Narva. Do we really believe that the United States is going to go to war for one town in Estonia? I'm not sure I do anymore. At a time when the NATO alliance is coming under increasing strain, these fears are not necessarily unfounded. While it's easy to imagine NATO allies rallying to defend a large-scale invasion of a member state, they may not all be quite as willing to scramble jets and deploy troops if Putin argues he only wants to take a single city. This would tie into the Kremlin's recent strategy of poking and prodding at NATO's borders, sending small amounts of drones or even Russian jets into the likes of Polish and Estonian airspace. These kinds of provocations aren't quite big enough to trigger a serious military response, and so they allow Moscow to learn more about where NATO's limits really lie and how strong its bonds truly are. The fifth and final reason to target Narva is that even though it may seem like a relatively small and insignificant city on the outside, it actually holds quite notable economic importance. It's the home of Europe's largest rare earth magnet factory, which opened in September 2025 and was funded by the European Union. The plant produces permanent magnets for use in important economic sectors such as microelectronics, wind turbines for green energy initiatives, and electric vehicles. It's an important addition to the European economic landscape, as it greatly enhances the continent's capacities in the rare earth sector and allows the EU to reduce its reliance on China. Should Russia invade and seize control of the city, it could potentially find a way to use this factory as leverage in any subsequent negotiations with NATO or the EU. Because of all these reasons and others, Estonian officials and Narva residents have been readying themselves for a Russian invasion for several years, and the country's opposition to Russia has risen dramatically in recent times. As the Chatham House report notes, this small Baltic nation has been one of Ukraine's biggest and most reliable supporters from day one of the invasion, providing Kyiv with more military aid in relative terms than any other country on earth. Within Narva itself, recent times have also seen more locals take an active interest in the Kites Elite, Estonia's voluntary defence army. Many members of the younger generation have opted to enlist and undergo basic military training in preparation for an invasion. They can get involved from as young as 7 years old, first learning basic survival skills in scout-style groups like map reading and surviving in the wilderness, before progressing to more advanced skills later on. Chatham House spoke to one such volunteer, 17-year-old Maria Morozova, who expressed her willingness to learn valuable skills and get ready for the worst-case scenario. "Nobody lured me here, I came of my own accord. I wanted to join a more serious organisation where I could contribute and, if necessary, defend the country." She's part of a growing wave of young Estonians who are politically aware and proud of their home, ready to do whatever is necessary to defend it. "No one loves war, I hope it doesn't come to that, but if it does, I would fight." But Estonia is doing much more than relying on young men and women to defend its borders. It's also ramping up fortifications along the length of its border with Russia, focusing on areas that are deemed most likely to be targeted in an invasion, such as Narva. Following the examples of other Baltic states and European countries like Poland, which have all also been working on improving their defences, Estonia has invested heavily in the likes of bunkers, border surveillance systems and forward defence measures, turning Narva from what may have once appeared an easy target into one of the most closely monitored and strongly secured border points in all of Europe. The new defences include over 60 miles or 100 kilometres of new border fences, much of which are equipped with state-of-the-art surveillance systems, patrolled roads and monitoring masts, allowing Estonia's military and leadership to keep a close eye on any suspicious activities or signs of military activity along the length of its border with Russia. Construction is ongoing in the most sensitive areas, like the Saatse region, where roads linking Estonian and Russian territory have been permanently closed and rerouted, and radar coverage along the Narva River is expanding all the time, broadening Tallinn's view of not only its territory but the surrounding Russian regions too. In addition to the fences, Estonia is also hard at work on its Baltic defence line, an entire network of reinforced bunkers, anti-tank obstacles, and other physical barriers that wouldn't just delay an invasion but could completely stop it in its tracks. By 2027, Estonia wants to have 600 of these concrete bunkers built, each one specially designed to withstand heavy artillery shelling and fully integrated with mobile units, drones and fire support teams. With such strong defences, even a relatively small nation like Estonia, with a military that's a mere fraction of the size and strength of Russia's, would be able to defend its border much more effectively, making any attempted invasion an incredibly costly and chaotic one for the opposing side. And Estonia isn't stopping there. The country is not only hitting NATO targets, but exceeding them. It's now spending close to 5% of its GDP on defence, well ahead of many other member nations, and it's using that money effectively to fund ammunition stockpiles, invest in high-end air defense systems, and purchase missiles, drones, and more. It also enjoys plenty of support from NATO allies, with a UK-led battle group permanently stationed on Estonian soil, and Tallinn is exploring additional ways to bolster its defences, including organising large-scale military exercises, reserve call-ups, and host nation support infrastructure, ensuring that allied units are ready to operate and activate as soon as possible should any kind of crisis emerge. As Hanno Pevkur, Estonia's defence minister, puts it, the aggressor must know that if they try to cross the border, they will die here. Now, you can learn more about how Estonia is gearing up to give Russia the surprise of its life if its forces dare approach its borders in this video. Or check out this video to see how size doesn't always matter, as one of Estonia's smallest missiles could give Russia a massive problem. And make sure to subscribe to our channel to continue hearing about the latest military news, developments, and analysis of new weapons, defences, and innovations from around the world.